Hi there everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Uncast Show. So I want to wish you a good morning, good evening, good afternoon to wherever you're watching this from in the world. Now, as you all probably know, there's loads of new cool Docker features, but there's also loads of actually awesome VM features as well. And we're going to be taking a bit of a deep dive into VMs. We're going to be looking at all of the new features that the VM Manager offers, and we're also going to be looking at snapshots and how we actually restore them. Okay. Now, I have spoken in detail about the Tailscale integration into Unraid Docker containers. So I'm not really going to go into it that much in this video. So if you want to know all about Tailscale and Unraid, then I really suggest you watch the Uncast video where we really deep dive into that, looking at all of it in detail. But for those of you who haven't seen it, we'll quickly talk about it. What we can do is we can take a container. So let's take this Firefox container here. And if I go to Edit and scrolling down here, you can see this button here we've got called Use Tailscale. If I toggle that on, what this allows me to do is install Tailscale directly into this Docker container. So what I will do is I'll call it Firefox and then scroll down. I'm not going to set anything else at all here. I'm just going to click on to apply. And now at the bottom, you'll notice on Docker pages, we've got a little button here that says View Container Log. Now, this is just quite useful for nothing to do with Tailscale. Just generally, I find it quite useful to be able to view the log straight away after installing a container. But with setting up Tailscale for the first time, we do actually have to click this button, or well, we have to view the log anyway. So we can see here that the server's installed Tailscale into this container. And so all I need to do now is authenticate this by signing into my Tailscale account, which will then add this container straight into my tailnet. So why is that useful? Well, it means we can access the containers from anywhere we like, but also we can actually share them with other people. You just pop their email address in and click on to share. And then that means anyone that I want to, I can have them share this Firefox container totally privately. It's not exposed on the internet. So a really useful feature in Unraid 7. And now if we look back at the installed container here, we can see this little icon that tells us that Tailscale is installed inside of this container. And now clicking on the container here, you can see we've got an additional web GUI button here, which uses the Tailscale address. So if I click onto that, allowing us in this case to log into Firefox through our Tailscale address. So definitely a very useful feature. Okay, so moving on to the VMs tab now. Now, there's a lot of changes here. We've already seen at the top here where we can see various metrics about the running VMs. And if I was to start up another one, we can see metrics for each that are running. Now, one very nice feature as well is we can actually now create snapshots of our VMs. So here, if I click Create Snapshot, I can actually create a snapshot of this running VM. And when I have this little button checked here, Memory Dump, it will even make a snapshot dumping the whole RAM of this VM as well into the snapshot. So what that means is when I start back up the VM, it will be in the exact same position as it is now. So if I had an Excel spreadsheet open, for instance, that same spreadsheet would be open. If I was halfway through watching a video, it would continue from that point in time where the snapshot was taken that I was watching the video. So here we can see we've got a snapshot name and we can give it a description. So the description, I'm just going to call it Uncast. So you can see here that the native file system that I'm using is ZFS. So if I check this, it would use ZFS to make the snapshot. If it's unchecked, it will use QEMU to make the snapshot. Now, I'm going to use QEMU myself here. Now, for this VM, I'm not going to do a memory dump, and I'll explain why in a moment. So I'm going to click on Proceed and take the snapshot. And now if we look at this VM, we can see this VM has got one snapshot. And if we look at the others here, we can see it says they all have none. Well, in fact, this NixOS one, it looks like I've made a snapshot before. Now, I did say I wasn't going to actually take a snapshot of this VM and dump the memory at the same time. Now, I'm going to show you why. So if we look at this VM here, I've got an RTX 3080 passed through to it. So if I try and take a snapshot now, let's call this uncast2 as the description, and I leave memory dump enabled and click proceed, I'm going to get an error. You can see here the pass-through devices are mentioned here saying that VFIO migration is not supported in the kernel. Now, basically this is because I'm trying to take a snapshot of the RAM in the VM, and pass-through hardware does complicate matters. So if you get that error, just keep that in mind. You won't get that error if you take a snapshot of a VM with no hardware pass-through. Okay, so let's create a brand new VM, and we'll take a snapshot of that in a moment, because it will give me a good opportunity to show you some of the cool new features in Unraid 7 regarding VMs. So obviously, I'm going to click on to add VM here, and I'm going to choose a template. I'm going to install a Linux VM, so I'm going to choose Linux. So I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to call it Pop OS. So just as we used to, we can put in a description here. So let's call it test1 VM. But underneath here, we can see there's something different. Now, I'm going to go back across, I think, to Unraid 6 quickly, so we can see the VM template there. So here's the exact same template on Unraid 6. So we can see here, we've only got description, then we come to CPU mode, and then our logical CPU. So let's go back to 7, and here we have a web UI that we can actually start from. And clicking here on the little question mark here, it expands information that we can see about the various sections. And here under Web UI, we can see here that we can actually change the Web UI for which we want when we click on it for the VM to go to. And a great example of this, if we look on my other VM here, where I run Home Assistant, clicking onto here and then going Open Web UI, here I've specified the Web UI of the Home Assistant VM, then clicking here, it goes straight into Home Assistant. But also one thing to notice is we can still also just go into the normal VNC console as well. So in my opinion, a really useful feature for VMs that may be running various services, because we can just click on the Open Web UI and go straight in. So basically any OS that's managed by a Web UI, well, we can actually specify it here, and it makes it super easy for us to be able to access and manage it. Okay, so next we can choose the host CPU or an emulated QEMU CPU. But if we see here, there's this extra part here where it says migratable, and this can be turned on and off. Okay, so just what is this migratable? Well, in QEMU, migratable is actually by default turned on. And what it's used for is for live migration. It lets you move a virtual machine between two different physical servers without actually shutting them down. Now, here's one thing though, is Unraid doesn't actually support live migration, so we don't need this feature. And actually leaving it on can limit the CPU's performance in VMs because it hides some advanced features that keeps things compatible across different hardware. So since we don't need it, my advice is to actually turn it off, and you're going to get better performance, because your VM then can take advantage of the full power and all of the features of your CPU. Okay, so obviously I'm going to leave this turned off. Now I'm going to choose some logical virtual CPUs here. I think that's going to be enough. Now, personally, I never have the first CPU ever pinned with my VMs because Unraid tends to want to use that one. So I think it's best actually to leave that unpinned. Okay, so memory, I think 8 gigs is going to be enough. And machine type here, we can choose QEMU or i440FX. And we can see we can go up to 9.1 here. That's because it's related to what we saw earlier when we looked at the QEMU version here. So whatever the QEMU version is, you're always going to have that version that we choose in our VMs here. So I'm going to use Q35 here. Now, everything else here is the same as it was in Unraid 6. But there's one thing I'm going to show you in a moment is connecting an install ISO to the VM. Now, of course, we can do it as we used to by clicking here, and then that brings up the ISO share on the server, and we can choose our ISOs this way. And now I'm actually going to choose the wrong ISO. I'm going to choose Bazzite here, and I'm not actually going to be installing Bazzite because this is Pop! OS. And I'm going to come back and show you how we can easily change the ISO in a moment. So let's scroll down now and add a virtual disk. So let's make this 50 gigs. And I'm going to select a QCOW2 disk because I prefer QCOW2 personally. Now there's one new thing here. We can see here, discard. We can basically turn the trim on and off on the VM if the V disk is on an SSD. Now we didn't have this in Unraid 6, as you can see here. So by default, this is actually on. Now, just as in Unraid 6, we can specify a serial number for the V disk if we want to. But let's move down to the next new feature here, is if we pass through a GPU. So here, say I was going to pass through my RTX 3080, and obviously passing through a GPU, you should always pass through the sound counterpart. But what we can do now in Unraid 7 is we can, when we're passing through a GPU, we can enable multifunction here. And what this does is it basically makes the GPU appear like a real piece of hardware. Because obviously with a GPU, the VGA part and the sound part are on the same piece of silicon that's plugged into your PCI slot. So if we don't enable multifunction, it can make the GPU look like it's two separate pieces of hardware. So by enabling multifunction, this gives us better performance in the VM when we're passing through a GPU. Now, the only way to do that in Unraid 6 was to actually edit the XML, which could be rather tricky. So now we've got the option here to be able to turn this on and off from inside of the GUI. So I think that's a really, really nice improvement. But I'm not actually going to be using a pass-through GPU for this VM. I'm going to be using a virtual GPU. And let's get rid of the sound as well. So here, nothing really that's been added. So let's scroll down to the next new feature. Now in Unraid 6, this would have been the end of the actual template. But can you see here, it says advanced tuning options. Well, let's go to Unraid 6, and at the bottom, we don't see that at all. So if I scroll down even further, we can see there's some more advanced features that for most users you probably won't need, but they can be really, really cool. Now, something I really like here is this QEMU command line part, where we can put in basically special XML that allows us to do fancy things with our VM. Now, I'm going to show you one thing on another VM where I use this, and that's this VM here, which is called Razer Laptop. Now, this VM actually, I never actually created it as a VM specifically. This actually used to be my Razer Laptop before I was drinking a cup of tea and I managed to drop it on the laptop and destroy the machine. It was a really sad day for me. But so what I did is I took out the NVMe and I popped it into the Unraid server and I copied the NVMe. That's why we can see here, it's about 1 terabyte. Now I had a lot of software on there and various kind of licensed software that I wanted to make sure would run properly. So what I did is if we look at the template of this one and I scroll down, you can see here I've put in some extra QEMU command line. So what I've done is I've specified various things to make this look like it was my Razer laptop. And so this is actually the VM running. Now the Razer laptop, it had a 3080 inside of it. So that was quite lucky because it was the same GPU I had inside of my server. So we can see that's here. But if I open up the settings here and look at About System, we can see here that it thinks it's a Razer Blade 15 Advanced model mid-2021. Now, also, I made sure that the device ID and product ID matched for this Windows VM so that all of my software would work. Now, something else that is pretty cool is if we check what the UUID of this actual VM is, that's the UUID here. Now, I specified this inside the QEMU command line as well. And putting it here overrides what's in the XML when the VM is first created. Now, I'm going to show you something pretty cool, which I didn't show you earlier, is we've also in Unraid 7 got this little button here where we can show inline XML. So what this can do is show us the XML alongside the graphical GUI display of the VM. So I think that's really cool that we can see both together. So here you can see the UUID of this actual VM that the hypervisor specified, well, I've overridden it with what the UUID was really on my Razer laptop at the time. So what this did is allow me to basically keep running my laptop, and Windows wasn't any the wiser. Now, using this in combination with other techniques can be a good way of making an OS think that it's not running actually as a VM. Now, I might do a detailed video to do with that at some time. So if you want me to, if enough people ask, then we might make a video on that. Okay, so that's what the QEMU command line part of the VM template's for here. Now, also here, we can change the clock offset and the timer source. And a very interesting thing at the bottom here is something called evdev. Now, this is another way of passing through things like keyboard and mice. Now, I don't actually have anything plugged into my server at the moment, but what it does is it allows you to pass it through in a different way, basically, than when you plug in a USB keyboard or mouse into your system and have it pass through that way. So evdev can have two advantages. It's got slightly better performance and lower latency than even if you pass through your USB keyboard and mouse as a USB device here. It also allows us to pass through USB keyboard and mice to really old systems, things like Windows 95 that don't even have USB drivers, and still be able to pass through keyboards and mice to systems like that. Okay, so that is all of the new things in VMs in Unraid 7. So I better not click on Create because remember, I've got the Bazzite ISO here. So I'm going to untick Start VM after creation, and I'm going to click on to Create. Okay, so here's the VM. Now, if we move across here, we can see this column here where it says VDisks and VCDs. So VDisks, well, we all know what that is, virtual disk. And here VCDs is basically ISO images, virtual CDs and DVDs. Now, remember, I had the Bazzite image in, and if I click here, we can actually see that. Now, notice this little eject button, so I could remove it this way. So now we can see no CD is inserted. So I could either click here or here now, and now we can select an ISO image. But the good thing is we can select it from anywhere on the server. Now, when we're doing it in the template, it only allows us to select from the ISO share. So say you've just downloaded an ISO and it's in your download share on the server. Well, this would be the way you want to add it. Because here, you see, I can browse through all of my shares here and add an ISO image from anywhere I want. So anyway, I'm installing Pop! OS. So let's install this one here. And I'm going to click on to insert. And so now you see that we've actually swapped over the image to the correct one. So now I can actually start up the VM and do the install. Oh, okay, so it's all installed. Let's log in. Okay, so I'm going to open up YouTube here. Oh, God, no, I'm not a robot. Right, let's type youtube.com. rather than a search. And let's put on a cat video. Okay, so as this is a short, it should just keep replaying and replaying. So I'm going to minimize this now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and take a snapshot now, but I'm actually going to have another error. Now, I wanted to show you this so you can understand why the errors happen and not worry about it if you have the error. So I'm going to click on to create snapshot. And if you remember, I said that we can dump the memory when there's no hardware being passed through. So I'm just going to call this first install, and I'm going to choose memory dump, and I'm not going to check this. I want to use a QEMU snapshot, and I'm going to click proceed. So 3, 2, 1, error. So what we can see here is it cannot migrate the domain. So remember when I was talking about the migratable setting in the VM template? I said Unraid doesn't actually use this feature to migrate a VM from one server to another. But if we want to make snapshots and dump the memory, we do kind of need this. So it's a choice that you have to make. Do you want slightly better performance and have migratable turned off? Or do you want to be able to take snapshots of the VM and dump the memory at the same time? Okay, so let's turn off this VM and edit it, and we'll change the CPU to be migratable and start it back up and go straight back to YouTube and play our cat video. Let's minimize this now. And now let's try and take our snapshot. So third time lucky, hey? So I'm going to click on to create snapshot. Again, I'm going to call it first install. I'm going to dump the memory and I'm going to click proceed. Okay, so finally we've actually got our snapshot along with the memory being dumped. Okay, so let's go back and the video is still playing. So let's close this. Okay, so that's all closed and let's shut this down. Okay, so how do we actually restore a snapshot? Well, what we do is we go to our VM and we click onto it. Now here we can see snapshots at the bottom. Here's the description I gave it saying first install, the date and time the snapshot was made, and the type of snapshot that it was. And here it tells us the parent, which is the base install when I actually installed the VM. And we can see here that the vdisk is no longer the vdisk one like we had earlier. So let's start back up the VM and let's go in here and just delete a whole bunch of files. So I'm going to delete these folders here, move them to trash, and let's empty the trash. And we'll imagine those folders were all full. So let's shut down the VM. So back at the VM, let's go ahead and restore the snapshot. So let's click onto the VM here. And at the bottom here, we can see snapshots. And here, if we click on these little two lines here, I can click revert snapshot and go back to this snapshot. So I'm going to click onto that now. And what we can see here is it's going to remove this vdisk here, which is what we're pointing to at the moment. So I'm going to click on to proceed and do that. And so now do you see that we've gone back to vdisk1.qcal2. So that was the base image of what the snapshot was actually using. So it's kind of slightly different to what you might be used to with ZFS snapshots, where you actually roll back to the snapshot. When you roll back with a QEMU snapshot, you kind of roll back to the moment just before you took the snapshot. So we can see the VMs running here now. So let's open up the VNC window. And hey, the cat video is playing. Absolutely awesome. So because we actually dumped the memory as well, the VM is just continuing from that moment in time. And if we close this now and we go and look at our files and folders, well, they're all back as well. So it's very easy to be able to take snapshots and restore VMs. But just remember the caveats when it comes to snapshots and the criteria you need if you want to make a snapshot and dump the memory at the same time. I can't think of anything else to tell you, but I'm pretty sure after publishing this video, I'll think of something. But hey, I'm going to show you guys something before I go. I've just got a new hard drive this morning. This is actually the largest one I've ever had, 22 terabytes. And I'm going to be using this in an upcoming Uncast video that should be out very soon, where I'm going to build an extremely low power server. It's going to be sipping electricity in the same way as a politician sips the truth, sparingly, if at all. Anyway, everyone, this brings us to the end of this Uncast show. Now, remember, if you want to watch about Tailscale, then check out the Tailscale episode on the Uncast show. And as always, I'll catch you all in the next one.